I will immediately hand over the word to Sijbren Cnossen. Sijbren is a professor at the University of Maastricht and at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and we'll talk about the long shadow of the EU VAT. And I'll try to find your presentation here.
Okay. Oh yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah, you did you do that with the previous speaker?
Yes, I tried that.
Okay. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've been a great admirer of the Nordic model of taxation, a great proponent of the dual income tax, for instance. I've even in a recent paper recommended that to the European Union, and generally I guess the Dutch and the Scandinavians get along quite well, and we don't have to dwell on the sort of affinity between you and us, or us and you. I think what I'm going to talk about is rather technical, but I'm glad to note that it sort of chimes with the previous lecture. Lars Skattereform says we need to finance this education. We need these non-distortionary, or least distortionary, he said correctly, taxes, and he mentioned particularly the VAT. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to talk about the long shadow of the European VAT, because I'm not very impressed by the European VAT. And I've got experience with VATs all over the world. I've just returned from Kazakhstan, where they also have a European VAT. Unfortunately, instead of a modern VAT, which you find in New Zealand, in Australia, Canada, and Singapore, South Africa, and some other countries. And we'll, as this unfolds, we'll see what that means. Now, let me see whether, yes, I can work this technique too. Here you've got sort of the poster for the lecture, and you see the authors there, Leon Bettendorf, my colleague at the Netherlands Bureau for Economic Policy Analysis, where I have an office these days. I'm long retired from Maastricht and Rotterdam. When you get to a certain age, that's what you have to do. But I'm still working at the CPB. And it's become a policy brief of the CPB, it's been published, etc. The main conclusions are, on the right-hand side, you can see that exemptions distort competitive conditions. There are many exemptions in the VAT, unlike the base of the modern VATs, which you find in the countries which I've mentioned, starting with New Zealand. And the reduced rate is also a very ill-targeted instrument to help lower income groups. That's not a very good thing. And Sweden started, I remember, with a uniform rate, and then later went to a dual rate structure. Even after, I think it's 1983, I seem to remember something like that, there was a study which clearly showed that the only people who would benefit from a reduced rate of foods were the yuppies, the young urban professionals who live together, share a household together, eat out a lot, buy high quality foods, and throw a lot of food away. These are the sort of people who benefit from a low rate on food products. And nevertheless, Sweden, and Holland could do that too, went for this dual rate structure. And my main recommendations is to harmonize the rate structure. And I'd really like to do away with the exemptions, and I'll show you the distortions. Of course, they are not the sort of least distortionary tax that Lars was recommending, and they should be. And maybe we should permit member states to have a better VAT than permitted under the 6th Directive. 6th Directive was decided in 1977, and basically has never been changed. In 1977, if you were already around, you probably weren't born yet, but then we didn't have globalization yet. We didn't have the enormous production of services, which are now account for 50–60% of GDP, and in those days didn't mean very much. A service was getting a haircut around the corner, but not much else, and that has changed greatly. We didn't have the internet yet, etc., and all of that. And the European VAT has really not kept pace with that development. And I would sort of pose that the VAT is only for revenue. Nothing else. It's not for influencing the income distribution. That's what the income tax is for. It's not for promoting industry. It's not for protecting trade, etc. That's what we use if we want to use it. The input duty is for if we want to promote industry, etc. We probably better look at the, and I wouldn't recommend it, but we better look at the corporate income tax and not at the VAT. And I think this European VAT should really look at those VATs, modern VATs, in other countries where they've really rethought the whole system. I met the Director General of this was years ago, 20 years ago, of the New Zealand Tax Service, and he said, Sijbren, we studied the European VAT for 2 years, and then we came to the conclusion that we had to start all over again, rethink the whole VAT. And that's what they did, and now they have the sort of cleanest, neatest VAT, least distortionary tax on goods and services in the world. The European Commission is now evaluating the VAT, probably would like to have a better VAT, you never know with the European Commission, but they want to have their own finger in that pie. And my idea would be to give the member states sort of more a say over the design of their VAT. Now, this was published in Finanzen, this article. And how do we evaluate the VAT? Well, if the VAT is primarily for revenue, we look at the revenue production of the VAT. And we call that the C efficiency, the collection efficiency of the VAT. And that's the ratio between the actual yield of the VAT and the potential yield. And the actual yield is what you actually collect, of course, and the potential yield is the standard rate times total consumption. And that is private consumption, that includes consumption by the government, and that includes consumption by non-profit organizations. And the difference there is the policy gap. If there is a difference between potential yield and actual yield, you can attribute that to, one, the policy gap, that's having lower rates, lower than standard rates, and that's having exemptions, basically. And you can attribute it, of course, to the compliance gap. That means that there is a difference between the actual yield and the yield according to the statute which you have enacted. And the policy gap in the European Union is substantially larger than the compliance gap. In Africa, and I'm now writing a book on the VAT in Africa, calling it work in progress, and you could use the same label for the European VATs, then it's the other way around. The compliance gap is much larger, obviously, than the policy gap. Here we've got the composition of the VAT yield in the Netherlands, and you see the potential yield, that's standard rates times total final consumption, and that ratio would then be 100% or 1, whatever you want to call it. And we see this policy gap, the size of the policy gap, the total, 44%, we would, the tax base would be 44%, 44% of the total tax base consists of exemptions, consists of the policy gap, and the lower than standard rate. And you can see here what the particular segments of that policy gap, how large they are. And the compliance gap is only €1.5 billion, and that's 0.2% of the potential yield. That is probably the lowest in the European Union, although the Netherlands is a very open country. And the actual yield, that's the C efficiency, is 40 billion, and that is only 54% of the potential yield. Now, and we'll look into that a little closer. And here I've got this. I've sort of analyzed the expenditures of the base of the VAT for the whole country. And what you see here is the difference between goods and services that are output taxed and that are input taxed. Now you want goods and services that be output taxed. You want to tax the output of businesses, of households, of whatever it is that is subject to VAT, and you do not want to tax the inputs because that conflicts with the fundamental law of economics that you should tax consumption and not production. You should tax output and not input. And here you see how large they are. Output tax is only 40% of total consumption expenditure. And so 60% of consumption expenditures is input tax, carries these distortions, which, as we will see, are not minor. And that's the conclusion. I've got that here. Or they can be exempted from VAT, or they can be considered out of scope. The VAT reflects very much a French philosophy. And the French philosophy goes back to Louis XIV. And Louis XIV believed that government should not be taxed. And institutions associated with government should not be taxed. So hospitals and education and all that, and public broadcasting should not be taxed. But of course, in a modern VAT, we think that they should be taxed because they also produce output which benefits consumers, and that should be included in the VAT base. And we've got this distortion of this, this violation of this fundamental law by Diamond and Mirrlees in 1971. Now here we've got the exemptions. We are all familiar with it: medical service, welfare, rents and rental values. But of course we tax newly created property, and that is, under some assumptions, quite a good substitute for taxing rents and rental values. Finance and insurance services, that is one of the biggest problems, but New Zealand and Australia have also found solutions for that, and so has Singapore and South Africa. South Africa has a much nicer VAT, better VAT, and it's better administered too than the European VAT. Sports, recreation, lotteries, all of that is exempt. And then we have government, and government is considered out of scope. It's not, it shouldn't be under the VAT where everything tells us that it should be. Now, what are the distortions when you exempt output and when you tax input? Well, first you have a sort of distortion of the input choice. When you are an exempt entity and you buy something, you will buy something which is taxed at the lower rate of the VAT, or which is exempt under the VAT, because then you pay, the total sum you pay in terms of price and tax is lower than when you buy a fully taxed input. So that distorts your input choice. It also, what it does, it promotes do-it-yourself. And you can see this. I mean, here is a head of a school, and he looks around the school building, and he says, well, it doesn't look very good. I mean, this needs a painting job. And then he talks to his teachers, and he says, so what shall we do about it? Well, they said, ask, somebody to give you an estimate of what the painting job costs. And that's what he gets, of course, various probably. And then he says, but there is this big tax item. In the Netherlands, that would be 21% tax on painting your school. He said, we don't want to pay that. Oh, he said, well, they say, let's do it ourselves. So then they start sort of, cluttering up the building themselves. And of course they are not in the painting job. They are not, that's not what they have been trained for. They've been trained to teach and not to do painting. So that's a sort of loss of welfare. It's not the way they should be doing. What should be done is that education gets taxed in full and that the school gets a credit, a deduction for the tax on paints, on the painting job. That's what we should be doing. And at the same time, we could increase the subsidy so it wouldn't have any effect on educational fees. It distorts exports and imports because this input tax cannot be relieved in subsequent stages of production and distribution, so it enters into exports, and imports are distorted too because foreign imports presumably are not subject to the VAT or have been completely relieved of the VAT and then can compete better in your market than your own products. And there is of course this violation of competition in respective sectors which are not exempted or out of scope. That's what the government does. If the government does something which the private sector can also produce, then and the government is exempt from the VAT, then the government can produce that at a lower price than the private sector entity. And that's not what the VAT should be doing. There is contentious tax allegation. What do I mean? When you produce exempt as well as taxable items, goods and services, then the tax has to be allocated between the taxable and the exempt goods, because the input tax on the exempt goods is not creditable, is not deductible from the tax on output, and the other tax is. And these distortions are also generally applicable to government. Now, Copenhagen economics has measured the efficiency loss of the exemption of health, education, cultural services, etc., at 3.4% of GDP, 1/3 of 1% of GDP. Doesn't seem very large, but in economies like us, you know, if we want to raise income, if we want to raise welfare, it's these little things that matter. And that's about €2 billion for the Netherlands, and I guess pretty much the same figure would hold for Sweden. And it especially hurts SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, because this outsourcing is, you find it in IT, you find it in administrative services, in laundry services, take a hospital, you find it in safety measures, etc. We have food supply, laundry supply, etc. And these particular services are provided by medium and small enterprises, and they are especially hurt by this exemption because these entities, exempt entities, are strongly induced to do all these services themselves. All right, well, they are, under modern FETs, they are taxed at the standard rate, these education, healthcare, and governments. And in New Zealand, they even tax local governments. And what do? They simply charge the VAT on local taxes. And of course, then they can give full credit for the services performed by the local government. And there is no incentive for the local government to do, say, garbage collection itself, rather than farm it out or tell some private entity to do it for it. And that's what we really would want, because then you get the most efficient decision. Second alternative would be to refund the VAT on inputs, sort of zero rate, these exempt sectors. That's what Canada does. But Canada is a special problem because it has all these subordinate levels of government, states and municipalities, etc. And the federal government, under the Constitution, cannot tax the states. So they have to find a special arrangement where the fat of the mesh sector, that's municipalities, academics, states and hospitals, are freed of the VAT by getting a refund of the VAT on their inputs. There is no feasible solution yet in sight for financial services. That's a very difficult problem because we cannot separate the return on, say, a deposit or on a loan, etc., from the intermediary service which you're providing in handing out this loan, etc. But there are good solutions found in New Zealand, or approximate solutions, and in Singapore, where they apply a zero rate of business-to-business services and exempt business-to-consumer services. And South Africa, for instance, taxes all fee-based financial services. All right. Now the reduced rate, that's what you have introduced, of course, on foodstuffs. It's also in many countries applied to hotels and restaurants, medical goods and dressings, passenger transportation, cultural activities, reading matter, and some other goods and services. Of course, the arguments you're familiar with. The reduced rate should be introduced to mitigate the tax burden on lower income groups, because proportionately lower income groups spend more on food than rich people. So if you tax food lower, then of course you mitigate the burden on the poor. It's not a very good argument, because in the Netherlands, for instance, the rich, and in Sweden that's exactly the same, the rich or middle income groups spend twice as much on food as the low income groups, and that's because they throw more food away, buy more expensive varieties, eat out more often, etc. In the Netherlands, for every euro of relief, the same should be true of Sweden, we give to lower income groups, and by imposing a lower rate on foods, we have to give €2 to higher income groups. Well, that's not a very sensible way of trying to help the poor, in my view. A reduced rate can correct for labor supply distortions of the income tax. That's obvious too. If you tax things like restaurant meals, eating out, or transportation, etc., at a lower rate than other goods and services, that might help the supply of labor. Now, there are some very interesting research has been done in the UK about this, but the effects are very, very small. One of the interesting effects is that drinking moderately alcohol improves productivity. So maybe there's a case for imposing a lower rate on alcohol consumption. I don't think I would oppose it. And of course, we could stimulate employment of labor-intensive services. We do that in many countries. The European Commission permits it, but there is a lot of leakage, and you have the problem that higher tax goods, like inputs to labor-intensive services, like the trading job, would get taxed at a lower rate along the way too, and it's not very helpful. If we really wanted to tax labor-intensive services, then obviously we should use the income tax for it, not the VAT. And when somebody comes and wants to paint my house, he says with or without. They probably do that in Sweden. And with means with VAT, without means without VAT. But he doesn't have the VAT in mind, he has the income tax in mind, of course, because he pays 52% income tax on the reward for his labor. And well, that's something I guess we don't want to see. Then merit goods. Education or healthcare should be taxed lower because it's a merit good. You don't want to constrain the consumption of these goods through the tax system, but what you could do is simply tax these goods, get rid of the distortions in the supply and demand side of this market, and at the same time increase the subsidies so the consumer will be no worse off than before. Okay. Oh, the VAT burden distribution of the VAT. Well, the first graph on the left side is against income. Obviously, the VAT is slightly regressive with respect to income because consumption as a percentage of income increases as income increases. And if you measure it against consumption, you see that on the right side of this graph, then it is slightly progressive. Okay, I said this already. In euro terms, higher income groups benefit twice as much from the reduced rate as lower income groups. That's these are the yuppies in Sweden. Ill-targeted way of helping the poor. They distort consumer and producer choices, and that is a welfare loss, and I'll give you an example shortly what a welfare loss is, and a reduced rate complicates the operation of the VAT because you misclassify goods or you put something different on the bill than it really should be. You have to separate your distinguish in your administration between lower tax goods and standard rated goods. Now, we could have a revenue neutral. We have, by the way, a standard rate of 21%, and we have a lower rate of 6%. That lower rate never changes. The standard rate goes up. And we could have a revenue neutral rate of 15.6%. And we could see what the effect is. Well, one of the effects, of course, and you see that in the left side of this graph, is that the regressivity becomes slightly stronger. It's obvious, because now you're taxing these lowly taxed goods at the standard rate. Now you can use your social benefit system, and we have a very sophisticated social benefit system like you have to compensate for that effect. You could increase the social benefits and people would not be worse off after the VAT reform than before the VAT reform. Well, this paper was published and it was sort of mentioned in Parliament, and well-thinking people in the Netherlands believe that the VAT should be should have a uniform rate, not the dual rate structure. Of course, the chairman of the left Socialist Party said, well, don't touch my food basket. And of course that made the headlines immediately the next days, and that was the end of the proposal. Okay, here is a sort of nice examples of a reduced rate and a standard rate. Books, and you can find a good reason why this distinction is made, but it doesn't make any sense. It's really nonsense. Books and newspapers are taxed at the lower rate, 6%, but e-books, digital newspapers, are taxed at the standard rate. Well, is that what we want? My grandson wanted a guinea pig, and then I had to tell him, but then the guinea pig feed, your mother has to pay the higher rate for the guinea pig feed. So you better ask for a rabbit, because then the feed is taxed at the lower rate, and your mother can just afford that lower rate. So that's a perfect example of a welfare loss. Because of the VAT system, you know, he had to choose the rabbit rather than the guinea pig, and as a result, his welfare, and my welfare too, was reduced. You see some other funny example. Bird feed with less than 95% grains is taxed at the standard rate, and bird feed with more than 95% grains at the lower rate. Well, dried flowers. When you sort of at my age, you see lots of people with walking sticks and walkers, and I always say, you know, skip the walking stick stage, because then you pay 21% VAT and go straight for the walker, because then you pay only 6%. Now, a haircut of a dog is taxed at 21%, but the haircut of a human being is taxed at 6%. So please take your dog with you to your own barber shop and let him have a haircut there. Now, these silly examples, and your VAT is balanced with these kinds of examples too, you find in the Dutch VAT. Really silly. Okay, the summation, the findings, I have 3 more minutes. It's probably now reduced to 1 minute or so, but I'm almost there. Of course, these exemptions and out-of-scope activities, and then I'm thinking of government distort consumer and producer choices. That's not what we want. That's not this sort of least distortionary tax and consumption. When you tax consumption is a much better tax than income in terms of distortions and in affecting economic growth, then we should go for this broad-based New Zealand type of VAT. The sea efficiency of the VAT, for instance, which I showed you in the Netherlands, was 54%. Sweden would be about the same percentage. In New Zealand, that's 100%, 98%. The sea efficiency, the collection efficiency. The reduced rate is an ill-targeted instrument to help the poor. This all violates EU objectives. And of course, the EU is about free trade and free competition, but this distorts free trade and free competition. Sometimes I think the European Union thinks that you can play football, soccer, by having one hand tied behind your back, but of course the conditions are then equal, but you don't have good soccer. So the conclusion is, why do we put up with these bad VATs? And if 28 member states, that's a problem, cannot agree to adopt a modern VAT, why not permit individual member states to do so? Sweden would have one, I think. The Netherlands would go for it. And I really believe that we can test that VAT against a non-distortionary theoretical VAT as we find in many of these modern countries which I mentioned. Well, thank you very much.